I'm Alice of All Trades, and this is the Sunday Book Circle for Recursion by Blake Crouch. Recursion is a sci-fi thriller that follows a scientist named Helena and a New York City police detective named Barry. Barry has been divorced for several years following the sudden death of his only child, Megan. While looking into a case off the books, he gets himself involved in something he could not even fathom. Helena is given the dream deal to explore her research into memory mapping in the hopes of one day mapping her mother's memories, but starts to suspect her benefactor, Slade, has other, less altruistic aims. I love sci-fi of any medium or type. The point of science fiction is to explore the impacts of scientific ideas and how well humanity can handle those ideas made real. Typically, the answer is that we can't handle them at all. Jurassic Park is a good example of this. The novel, not the movie. So is The Terminal Man. The novel, not the movie. Okay, pick most Michael Crichton sci-fi and you'll know what I mean. This mostly applies to sci-fi that is only slightly more advanced than our current world. Dune and Dune-like novels don't really work like that, and in fact work more like the fantasy genre than they do most sci-fi. Sci-fi can also be used to explore the repetition of history regardless of place and circumstance, such as The Expanse and The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. Recursion falls firmly in the camp of Crichton-style sci-fi. Humans invent something and then use it to fuck everything up. So typical. But you can't put the genie back in the bottle. Except apparently when you can. But more on that in the spoiler section. Recursion is a breeze of a read. I blew through it without an audiobook and way ahead of schedule, because Crouch is masterful with both his prose and his ability to create a sense of urgency in the reader. There were a couple of action scenes that I wasn't clear on, but that seems to be the case every time I read action. I wonder if it's truly possible to describe an action scene that everyone can easily understand. I had the same problem reading the Dresden Files novels, and Jim Butcher has tons of practice at describing action. Like a lot of action-heavy fiction, I think Recursion would be better served to be a movie or a miniseries. Part of the problem is so many words are needed to set the scene in which the action is meant to take place, which slows down the narrative. But not setting the scene creates a fog over the action that makes it nearly impossible to picture that action. Where people are positioned is almost never clear in prose action. Recursion is not successful at overcoming this issue. The positionality problem is very obvious, and the fog is heavy. For this reason, I was not a fan whenever the action got too involved. The plot itself is a bit of a brain twister. While I liked his prose and sense of urgency, I felt Crouch did a disservice by putting the novel in present tense. The fact that Helena literally says, "There's no such thing as the actual present, since we have to filter all stimuli through our senses to our brains, everything we experience is thus delayed, rendering the concept of the present moot," is completely at odds with writing that conversation in the present tense. Fiction has an old standard of writing everything in the past tense, and the reasoning behind this is more obvious once someone tries to write descriptive language. Descriptive language, which is different than, say, critique or pure informational language, is used for setting a scene, but that language quickly becomes boring when we take too much of it in at once. Fiction writers, good ones anyway, have long learned that they need to vary their sentence structures and play with many of the same elements that poets employ in order to keep the reader's mind fully engaged in descriptive language. Past tense allows for the most variety in sentence structure. Future tense is just annoying, and present tense typically results in very rigid sentence patterns. I couldn't think of a sentence that really stood out as either amazing or awful in Recursion, which is bad on one hand and good on the other, but I did find his use of present tense difficult to get into every time I picked up the book. But enough of this highbrow bullshit, let's talk about Helena and Barry. Because of the way the story is structured, Barry and Helena's relationship is both central and out of focus. It has a bit of predestination to it. Nothing gets solved if these two don't meet. But they don't meet unless there is a problem to solve in the first place. Sort of like how Skynet doesn't exist unless they send a cyborg back in time and kill John Connor. At certain points, it is implied that their emotional connection transcends time itself. Counter to this, Crouch chooses to avoid mostly their first meeting or very good description of their other meetings. We also don't really see them up close and personal as a couple. We just hear that they love each other and get a general summary of things they've gone through as a couple. It's a little frustrating. Their relationship is so important and dealt with so casually that I felt a bit cheated. This is such a strange relationship that I needed to see more of it. I could have done with a lot of the first act being cut to explore their whole deal in depth instead. The predestined quality to their relationship is almost a cop-out to not have to write about how they fell in love. I've said this of other relationships in novels before, such as Salem's Lot, and it's something I've noticed that a lot of writers try to avoid, but also include, which means the relationship is just there magically, without the author doing the work. It might be an attempt to avoid the dreaded romance label, or it might be because they don't know how to write growing emotional connection. Or even both. I feel like that is all I'm comfortable bringing up without the spoiler warning, because so much of this book happens after the first act, including that romance, actually, but with a main male and a main female character, both single and of similar ages, that was pretty much obvious. But now let's talk spoilers. First of all, Barry's need to go back to the original timeline was confusing for 3 reasons. 1, the answer to the problem of people's knowledge of other timelines catching up was never solved. Why would going back to a different timeline prevent that? There's no real solution given. Secondly, how he is able to go back to a dead timeline isn't solved. He just does it. It makes no sense. Finally, he doesn't even go back to the original timeline. He goes back to the second timeline because the first is before the original test subject goes back to the car crash and dies with his wife. That's the original timeline, not the one where Slade kills Helena. This was so annoying because it shows that Crouch both couldn't solve the problems he created and couldn't even keep the timeline straight when the book was so much fun to read. He wrote himself into a corner. There was no way out of this. Time travel stories pretty much never make sense, but writers love messing with time, so we end up with a bunch of incomprehensible and broken time travel stories that people feel the need to explain or defend in articles and video essays, yes, like this one, because the rest of us must be too dumb to understand it, and that's why we say they don't work. And some of these defenses are made decades later because maybe the internet didn't exist when the broken time travel story came out in the first place. But really, the person defending it is just a fanboy that can't have his precious story have any flaws, because then why did he like it in the first place? When all the person has to do is learn to accept that not every story is perfect, and a story doesn't have to be perfect, or hell, even good, for them to like it. They could just accept the flaws like a goddamn adult, instead of being both a whiny bitch and a smarmy asshole because those flaws exist and make it impossible for everyone to like the story. Seriously, not everyone has to like the same things for someone to enjoy what they like. I like stoner comedies. Not everyone does. They are almost always broken pieces of shit, but I enjoy them. Recursion is just one more broken time travel story. It's a good one, but it's still broken. Most time travel stories are broken. Except Harry Potter. That one works. I mentioned that Crouch doesn't show Barry and Helena's relationship in any kind of depth, even skipping over the most important parts, but I also was annoyed by how much of Recursion took place off the page in other ways, like Slade's murder of Helena, or the first test. So it wasn't just Barry and Helena's relationship that was white-spaced, it was other major plot points, including that fucking cop-out ending. Oh, what's he gonna say to her? Will they get together? Are they destiny? Come on, man. Just make a damn decision. I'm sick of writers trying to use intrigue to cover up their inability to come to a decision. Be brave. Put it on the page. At least imply what's going to happen. This kind of ambiguity isn't cleverness. It's two things. A lack of spine and a need to force people to discuss the story long after it is over. They get to force readers into an argument over what happens next while being a coward. I'm not saying don't ever be ambiguous, but this was bad ambiguity, and it was pretty overt. Now I want to talk about the ramifications of the technology in the book. The book starts off with an amazing bang. Too many novels start and end boring, especially these days with all the autobiographical literary novels coming out that have no major dramatic question and are plotless from beginning to end. So when Recursion starts with a suicide, I was like, yeah, that's how you start a novel. Now that woman, Anne, her story is so cruel. Her husband erased their love and their child because he couldn't deal with the guilt of not having saved his first wife. What a fucking monster! And his first wife then lives with the memory of her death. We should never have the ability to go back and correct our mistakes. I suffer from an anxiety disorder. I can focus for hours on mistakes I made 20 years ago, but I would never go back and change my life, especially after reading this book. It is so unhealthy to go to these lengths to not deal with your problems. We cannot undo the past. We shouldn't want to in the first place. We don't learn from the past if we can change it. And we should absolutely look to our past, both personally and historically, to learn and improve. Not accepting the past and our hand in it on personal matters is toxic. It means we cannot grow. Not accepting the past and learning from it in historical matters is dangerous. We are then doomed to repeat the most horrific of tragedies. If someone is trying to convince you to blame others for your personal past instead of growing from it, understand that they are trying to hobble you for life. If someone is trying to convince you that history doesn't matter, understand they want to do something inhumane to you or to others, and they want your complacency. We can't ignore the past, but we can't fixate on it either. We have to live in the now and prepare for the future. And the best way to do that is to learn from and accept the past. Recursion gives a heavy life lesson. But because of the execution, I feel it might be too buried for most people to grasp. Would I suggest Recursion? Yes, actually. Despite its problems, it is an enjoyable read with a lot of thought-provoking ideas. It's not perfect, but it's a damn sight better than a lot of the literary novels I've slogged through recently, and is still serious. But that's what I love about sci-fi. It can present interesting ethical dilemmas while also providing an interesting plot. I've added all of Blake Crouch's books to my to-be-read pile because in my giant list of recently read contemporary novels, it is one of the better ones. But what did you think of Recursion? Did you love it? Hate it? What about it stood out to you? What did you think of the scientific theory? What did you think of the issues I brought up? Let me know in the comments below, and please mark all spoilers. Would you like to see what I'm currently reading? Follow me on goodreads.com/outsfalltrades to see what I'm reading right now and what book reviews you can expect in the future. I've made a Discord. I'm on it all the time and you're all invited to chat with me. There are channels for video games, movies, TV shows, books, and writing. Even a place for you to promote your own things. Join me there. Everyone is welcome. Merch, 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 merch. Yeah. Check out my new shop at cafepress.com/outsofalltrades for all kinds of products with my face on them.